Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajeem. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. I'm your host Faiza Naqvi with a prayer. May Allah keep you all safe, healthy and blessed. And may Allah hasten the appearance of Imam of our time and make us true companion of our Imam, inshallah. Ameen. Today the topic we are about to discuss is related to economy of the world and what system is operating this system of economics around the globe, and who is the beneficiary of the system, and are we getting enough from the system? Is it the right system, and how it helps or it doesn't help, whatever. So what ideology is behind the system and how it impacts everyday life of an individual, and not only individual but also the economies of this world. So we will talk about it in further details, like what system is prevailing in this world. Apparently looks like capitalism is the system, but we will dig into it deeper, and I'll discuss with our very prestigious guest Sayyid Muhsin Abbas, and I'll move on to our guest and we'll see what is it all about. Assalamu alaikum, Muhsin Bhai. Thank you so much for your time once again for Hidayat TV. I'm really honored to have you on the show on this very important topic of economy. And I would like to ask you, what is economy, and how important it is for us to understand the structure of this economic system?
Well, economics is really the science of trying to manage essentially wealth, manage assets, material, and otherwise in a way which ideally profits and benefits mankind. Now, that word profit can be used in many ways. Economics from an Islamic perspective also needs to be analyzed, and perhaps we'll have another show where we can go into the details of what Islamic economics really is. And in that regard, I've started studying in more detail the Iqtisadun of Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Baqir Sadr, who wrote a phenomenal piece of work around our economics. Literally, that's what he called it, our economics. So anybody who wants to study economics, first of all, that's your reference point. Do go onto alislam.org, which is one resource which has got the PDF, I think, for that book, at least maybe for one or two of the sections. Otherwise, you can buy it, presumably, from most sources. So it's important to know our main sources. That's the one that I refer to primarily. In terms of practical examples, of course, the only state we have which is even attempting to be Islamic at the moment, in the real sense of the word, based on the Quran and the Sunnah and the Ahlul Bayt's example, or even if, in fact, their political economic example, is the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the only one which has an absolute ability and autonomy and sovereignty to be able to try to put together an independent political system. And I mean independent because the reality is that economics is subservient to at least one other thing, which is basically the people, the people's culture, an environment or a system, an overall system within society also dictates the economics. So the political aspects of society, the social aspects, and the cultural, they can't be excluded from the conversation because they will influence the economics that emerges. The worldview of a society or a people, of course, impacts what economics they want. And I think this is where, first of all, our discussion can begin on the issue of Western capitalism, because Western capitalism, as we know it today, is really still the dominant force in global economics. And of course, that centers around Washington and the United States more latterly, but previously it was largely in the European capitals and colonial powers. So the transfer of the economic system of the imperialist colonial powers to the imperialist United States of America, if you like, nexus. I would call it a Zio-American nexus or an Anglo-Zionist nexus. It is what dictates most of the world economy, or at least has for the last 100 years or so. At the heart of that economics is oil, which has been the major, sector hanging over the world, and most of the economics of the West since 1970 certainly was all linked to the petrol and the petrodollar. So the dollar and America and oil are very much at the heart of the economics of the West, certainly even today. Maybe less so, but and there are huge changes that are taking place within this reality that has been reality of most of us for our lifetime anyway. Now, the economics that evolved here in the West, certainly the economics that evolved in the US, is also important to look at. The origins you asked of it. Of course, we have to go to the centers of the Western political power base in order to be able to study the economics and what its purpose is, and also to look at the society and what it wants and why its economics is the way it is. So the first thing I would say is that those who shaped the US economy, of course, it's not difficult to work them out. They exist, and there's a whole slow study that people need to do about how American economics emerged, because it's a really quite bizarre and frightening one. One in which global capitalism and global corporate power has more or less usurped Western or American political power into the early, the early-ish period of the 20th century. And names like Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the banking cartels certainly become very prominent in those people who shaped the development of American power and American economic power. Certainly, other names today like Morgan Stanley will pop up. All these are individuals that one needs to research in detail. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. These are all private bankers from the American side. Of course, the banking world existed in Britain prior to this, and a lot of what the Americans inherited were the baton passed on by the Rothschilds, who essentially controlled the City of London and the banking system here during the British Empire, or at least the latter part of the British Empire, for sure. Certainly, that British Empire and that British colonialism was rooted in arguably the first ever transnational corporation, which we can pinpoint. And that is the East India Company, the British East India Company, which is very famous for its intervention in India, or it's Mughal India particularly, and at the time it became a huge political force through its economic wheeling and dealing on that subcontinent, and indeed it became a power across the world from the West Indies and the Americas as far as the East and China. I think you have to look at the modern day economics in the context of the goals and objectives of this fraternity primarily, because the crown of England or the crown of Britain was different from the East India Company, yet they were partnering in many things. That difference has retained itself because in the City of London, many people don't know this, but in London, we have the Corporation of London, which is the body which runs the square mile. So where virtually 80% of Britain's wealth and maybe even the world's wealth essentially passes through at one point or another. The City of London being the economic hub, Liverpool Street, Bank of England and beyond, and all these bases for the banks that they have there, is essentially the economic hub and the controller and the key mover and shaker in terms of global economics today, along with Wall Street. And of course, Hong Kong was the other major base in the East. So you see, there are very discernible individuals and families and corporations and places that we can see, institutions that we can see which represent economic power. The most obvious ones today, if I was to bring the East India Company into the modern age, of course it doesn't exist in its previous name or whatever. It was obviously either done away with, or it just simply had served its purpose. But names like now, which are more relevant, are BlackRock, Vanguard, and various other hedge fund operators, forces which have trillions of dollars in their control. They basically essentially use the money that exists out in the transnational corporation world, and they essentially place it to try to make profit for whoever their clients are, supposed clients. In reality, global Western capitalism really strikes me as a bit of a pyramid structure, although it looks like there's chaos and there are many competing corporations. When you start looking at it more closely, you realize that actually most of this wealth that exists in the world, and most of the transnational corporations, which include the likes of Coca-Cola or Pepsi or McDonald's or any of the larger transnational corporations you can care to mention, an overwhelming majority of them will be under the umbrella of these few economic powers, which are non-state. They're non-state powers. They have economies which are bigger than most of the sovereign states of the world. That's how powerful they are. They're capable of also being above any particular law in any particular country, because they're not based primarily, their headquarters aren't in countries where they can be taxed by that country specifically. So, for instance, what comes in is the notion of offshore tax havens. And a lot of these companies will be based in the Cayman Islands or various other places where they are not subject to the scrutiny and the laws of any particular nation, so that they can do whatever they like with that money. And also, they don't have to be forced to say what they've got, where they got it from, and what its purpose is. So first of all, we have a little bit of a problem here. In Western nations, we talk about democracy and they talk about power of the people and equality. What they've got is, first of all, a pretty undemocratic economic system, first of all, which isn't accountable to the people. We've also got a problem of people at the top who are also unaccountable, because they're above the law in terms of what their wealth is all about. And they also have extraordinary amount of power around the world, and with that money, they can buy power and they can control power. So there is a fundamental problem of bias within the economic system as it exists, because those who have money and those who are rich and those who are powerful and have been for many centuries have the ability to also control our culture, our politics, our social values. And so much so that outfits like BlackRock that I mentioned, or Vanguard, they actually have social policies. They actually invest in certain companies that act in a certain way. They actually can dictate what is and isn't possible. Often they'll say it's because the public are demanding this, and therefore they're driven by the public's demand. But it's not. What the reality is they also have huge advertising power and huge control over cultural mediums. So therefore they can dictate the cultural mind shifts and the way people go, and then blame the people to say they wanted this. Now, what's at the heart of what they want? The heart of what they have is obviously capitalism, as you mentioned, but I would like to adjust it and call it hyper-capitalism. Capitalism which is out of control. Islam is not against capitalism per se. The idea that human beings should be able to buy and sell and profit and advance according to their hard work and their honest effort is not something which is against the moral values of Islam. But when it becomes hyper-materialism or hyper-capitalism, there's a problem, because a balance has been lost, and the purpose of the wider purpose, or the greater good, or the good of the majority, is inevitably going to be sacrificed. And that, I'm afraid, is what has happened with the current pyramid structure based on money lenders, huge people who are basically have accumulated so much wealth over the centuries that it's impossible to even begin to assess what that wealth is. So now that's happened, of course, as I said, because the power that coalesced has almost been a partnership between the executive arms of money power, let's call it money power now, and the thinkers and the economists and the wealth, the men of wealth or the women of wealth who are behind all of this. And that marriage has become so intertwined that the media comes into it, the education institutions are also brought into it, the political institutions are also sucked into that as well. And what you find is eventually this, what I call really the structural elite emerges. A structural elite, a systemic elite, a force which remains in the shadows and remains perhaps in the background, but actually is very much the shaper and the driver of a lot of what happens in our world on every level, as I've mentioned. So hyper-capitalism has emerged on the back of a capitalism which became transnational and global during the 19th century, particularly under French colonialism and more particularly under British colonialism, and now has evolved into this behemoth. And that capitalism now has an industrial military arms complex, which is global. It has transnational bodies like the World Trade Organization. It has an entire banking system controlled by the Bank of International Settlements, the World Bank. It has, of course, retail outlets and assets around the world, which are all based on what I call the theft of the commons. This is the second principle, violation principle on which Western economy is based. The first is this hierarchical structure which has disproportionate control of money and prints money almost at will without any real reference to any material thing. It just can print money from air. For instance, you put money in a bank, you put in £1, the bank creates another £1. So literally this banking system relies on a lie, that they create wealth or money that doesn't exist. We'll go into another time on details of what they do and why they do that. But this is another trick that's played. The very fact that money exists, paper in itself doesn't have any value. It doesn't, I mean, gold has value, silver has value, material things. The paper on which the pound or the dollar or the rupee is printed has no real value, no intrinsic value in and of itself. It only has a value because we support it and we accept it. Therefore, we say, yes, this exists. So there's a huge illusion that has been created about this paper or this digital currency, which is now also going to be coming up, about it having some value. So I think there are huge problems about the way we've allowed money power to emerge and what system they've created. Of course, now we're spreading out very widely, so I'm going to probably let you ask questions so I keep focused. But that gives you an umbrella. Of course, what's emerged with this hyper-capitalism system is also actually probably the defeat of another system which was running parallel to it for most of the last 150 years, and that was the Karl Marx communist or socialist mechanism, which was less about private enterprise, less focus on private individuals making money and then generating back into the community. And what was supposed to happen was trickle down, the concept of trickling down wealth. Was a few people, however, the idea was that the wealth would trickle down to others and the rest of society, because the generators of wealth were apparently these individuals, this few elitist sort of outfits at the top, or individuals. In reality, we've seen that capitalism doesn't work like that in its Western form. There are still people who are poverty-stricken in these countries, and there are still people who are poverty-stricken around the world, all of them tied down by the likes of the World Bank and the likes of the system that exists largely through Western hyper-capitalism. Of course, the socialist system also failed to some degree, certainly the way it was implemented by the likes of Russia or arguably China, and indeed they also started going towards a less controlled, state-controlled economic system or plan, and moved much more towards private enterprise. China is almost the first example of a totalitarian state, communist state, which is actually running an entirely capitalist system in their own style. We'll come on to that model, which may well be the one that is the future one that the world has to deal with. after dollarization is done away with, which also seems on the horizon. But that should give you an idea of how wide this topic is, and what we need to unpack to be able to understand it better.
So, what an individual can do, and what percentage of the people, for example, we do have like kind of 8 Arab people of this world, and how much percentage of this, the whole world have this money in their control, and what are their exact objectives, and how it is uh, how it is benefit them, obviously through the money and the power and the resources they have, but what are the dangers to the humanity at large from this whole thing? What are their objectives? So how do you see these two things?
Well, ostensibly, in the West, you could argue that the thing which the hyper-materialist economic system has exploited is the psychology of human beings. The likes of Freud and Edward Bernays and a lot of these people also play a big part in terms of what was to come, because shaping the future of man requires you to first of all understand the nature of man and what his desires are. And this is where Islam also comes into collision with the modern economic system, because what happened in a sense with the psychology and the direction that was taken by the likes of Bernays and Freud, and latched onto by the likes of Rockefeller, who then created the Rockefeller family, who were big oil merchants, but in the US, who also translated that into the world of education by creating a certain public school education system, and who also translated that oil wealth into impacting the economic system itself as well. So you can see that it's so porous, this relationship. When you have a lot of money, you can go in and influence anything, as I said in the early stages. So the way they influenced it and the way they manipulated it, I think they looked at the nature of man, just as the Holy Quran does. The Holy Quran looks in great detail. God tells us the nature of man, what our fitra is. And the fitra of man, as described by the Holy Quran, dictates also our economics, the way we ought to run it. Because the fitra is based on the divine morality and divine moral values and the virtues. The virtues, for instance, of generosity, honesty, charity, such values, and there are many others that you could talk, have a direct impact on what kind of economic vision you have, economic future. So if you abide by generosity of Islam, you have a very different worldview or an attitude to how you use money than a person who doesn't have that value, who does the opposite. Say, for instance, has the value of hoarding, or is insecure about his money and therefore is not generous. In fact, niggardly is probably the word. It's miserly. Right? That is a very different society. If you have somebody at the top who is miserly and somebody at the top of society who is very wealthy, who is generous. Now, Islam, of course, pushes for the idea of generosity. To some extent, the Western hyper-capitalist system would argue, yes, we do. We have charities that are set up to do this. But in reality, the Islamic system was one of zakat, which was systemically institutional. Khums and zakat become a system which was designed to eradicate poverty. And don't forget, Imam Ali alayhi salam, one of the hadiths that I can quote, unfortunately without reference, but it's a fantastic quote either way, that if poverty, he said that if poverty was a man, I would kill it. If poverty was a man, I would kill it. That's how Imam Ali alayhi salam saw the accumulation of a niggardly or miserly economic system as well. He would have destroyed it. He would have done everything in his economic policy to avoid the idea that poverty should exist at all. And poverty shouldn't exist. Because there is not, Allah says in the Quran, have I not given you abundance? Travel the world. Is there not enough in the world? The world has enough food to feed 30, 40, 50 billion people comfortably. Yet we're saying we're struggling to feed 7 billion people properly. This is the narrative coming from Western hyper-capitalist economists. So you can see that on the ground where there are some fundamental differences, and these differences in values are very, very important. The values that we have as a society will dictate. And what they did with a lot of the early psychologists was they fed the psychology of niggardliness, miserliness, hoarding, usury. They set them as values. Now, usury, of course, is completely banned in Islam. So, can you imagine a world in which there's no banking? There's banking without interest, without any exorbitant charges of interest. Can you imagine a world where profit isn't the number one priority? And can you imagine an economic world where also the idea that material wealth is the most important, is the only thing that really matters, or the idea that individual wealth is really sacrosanct, and then compare that to a world in which materialism isn't the main thing. This world isn't the most important thing, but God says, will give you even more in the next world if you have values of goodness and generosity and kindness and honesty and integrity and love and mercy and compassion. Now, an economic system based on these latter values that I've talked about is very different from the other one. The other one encourages wealth by any means, acquiring wealth by any means necessary. It inherently justifies pillaging and plunder. It inherently encourages hoarding. It encourages the few to have the most wealth and the many to have very little. I.e., the whole hyper-capitalist system we have is a sort of backhanded justification for a virtue and ethics and a moral and a value system which is incompatible with real, I would say, Abrahamic values, I would say Islamic values, I would say, humane values, civilizational values. So we're up against a system which is fueled by greedy people and justified by their systems, and also indoctrinates children and people from a young age to accept a value system and a practical system which is not in their interests, but rather is one which subjugates them and enslaves them to an economic and political system which serves primarily the wealthy and the elite. This is the fundamental problem that we're facing even today, and this is what the real struggle in a way is for society. But unfortunately, because the economics, the education, the culture, the political systems are all working in tandem within this system in order to keep, first of all, people unaware, asleep, acting according to a set of systems that are contradictory to their fitri values. Of course, we don't get change, because most people go through an education system which tells them to conform to those wider political and economic and social and cultural systems and values and norms, and people grow up thinking that's normal. So you're taught, for instance, and here's one of the dichotomies, you're taught from the age of infancy to about 9-10 years old, you're taught that honesty is good and all these things. Those values are given to you as a child, and then suddenly around 10 they stop teaching you all these values. There's no development of them. There's no inculcation. You see in secondary school, the emphasis goes completely onto the notion of individualism, getting a job, having a career. And there you see, Faizaji, that the career and the job and the emphasis on money is based on fear and insecurity, because without that job, you can't have money, you can't provide, you can't have a house. So you are instilled with this fear right from an early age that if you don't compete within the system, if you do not behave with what the system wants you, you will be punished and penalized, and you will end up with nothing, and you'll be destitute. And if you comply with the system, then the system will allow you with the degrees it gives you, with the other ratifications, references, and whatever. They'll allow you to come up into the system and to have greater wealth based on your behavior, basically. And that, in a way, is now also being done in a much more discernible way, for instance, in China, where we have modern technology which can monitor literally how we spend with the digital currency and with all the credit cards, how we spend, where we spend, what we spend. It can look, they can monitor that. And of course, there is this move towards surveillance capitalism and this digital currency as a means of giving these same money lenders and money power people even more control over society. So for me, China is a problem. To be honest, many people hail it as a champion of a new potential system that de-dollarizes and gets rid of Western imperialism. But we've got to be careful that actually it's not the same people, the people behind BlackRock and the Western economic world's system, the same capitalists, that aren't now moving towards China and developing a new system which is even more controlling, even more unfair eventually. So this becomes just so fascinating, economics, once you start realizing it, and you realize how much it impacts you, your child's school's education, your child's cultural behavior, your child's social behavior, your child's politics. All of it ultimately is affected by money and by money power and by, therefore, economics. Yet they do not teach you economics in any of their schools up to the age of, say, A levels. O levels, you might have an economic subject as an aside, but most people, 95% of students, never touch economics. They never really touch politics either, and therefore they can't have a real working understanding of it. So much so that people don't know what NASDAQ is, they don't know what the what the index is, they don't know what inflation is, they don't know basic economic terminology and jargon that's used. So even when they hear it on the news, actually it's meaningless because they don't know what it means. They don't know what inflation is. They don't know how to relate to many of these economic concepts. And of course, the experts don't explain it to them. They don't give context. So that what they're having is this conversation about the economy, which excludes 90% of the people who are left just feeling the impact. And all the people can do is look to their political institutions and say, at the election, I want you to come into power because you will be able to make me have a cheaper house or a cheaper mortgage, to bring the cost of my food down so that I can afford my food, and to make sure that I have jobs. This is the primary concern of most people about economics. And all of that is dictated by those systems and those individuals, and that system and those individuals are not, we, the people, are not party to changing those systems or affecting them, because we don't have the knowledge and we don't have the direction or necessarily the organizations. I'll give you an example of trades unions, which were broken by Margaret Thatcher here in the West. That some of the few weapons or systems that we had to take on this injustice, economic injustice, even those were destroyed and smashed deliberately by corporations and their backers and the politicians. So in the West, we have a serious problem. The only reason the West survives at the level it does, and you can't see poverty as badly as perhaps we might, and that's deliberate as well, because the plunder that comes from the East, most of the resources lie in Central Asia, in the Muslim world, or beyond, or Russia. That's where the oil, the gas, the lithium, the uranium, most of the mineral wealth is over there, or towards Latin America. Now, of course, those areas, those nations, are dictated to by Western armies. The people in power in those countries are also placed there and supported by Western institutions. They follow economic systems and education systems which come from the West. They are controlled by institutions like the World Bank and the WHO and the International Atomic Agency and the United Nations. All these, even private institutions, again run by moneylenders and money mafia power, they also dictate those nations. So you see that the Western capitalist system, hyper-capitalist system, exports its ideas. It imposes them, especially on the elites of those parts of the world, which means they have essentially an empire. They have a global political, economic empire. It's not a colonial power in the old sense of the word, because they don't go there to occupy the countries practically, but they buy up their own stooges, they train them in their own schools over there, and then they take them to their own universities, with Harvard or or it's Oxford or Cambridge, wherever, and then they will train them in their economics. There are political courses, there are political philosophy and economic courses, for instance, at Oxford, which most of these people go through. Tony Blair went through them. I think the head of the former head of the Liberal Democrat Party also went there. Many Rees Moggs, many of the politicians and economists go to these places. They learn their economics from there, and they then become compliant within the system and operate the policies. So I'm afraid we are encircled essentially by a structural elite that controls politics, economics, and our social cultural development and engineers it. I'm afraid they own most of the commons around the world, whether it's through front organizations of transnational corporations, or whether it's the Queen, well, no, it's not the Queen now, it's the King of England, for instance, owns something like 10% of the world's landmass in Canada, Australia, across all of Britain, many other areas, British, but they still literally own the land. So these are all basically fronts for ownership of the commons, and their money is hidden because there's so much money and so much wealth. They have to end up hiding it in order to justify, or not to look like as rapacious a set of plunderers they are. But that plunder has not stopped. The wars that usually emanate are banksters' wars, as it's often said. The wars across West Asia you see over the last 5-6 decades are all to control oil, to take the wealth from there, to make sure that the puppets who they placed in leadership are maintained, and also to destroy any rival system. So Islamic resistance, Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic Revolution, hence that became a huge enemy number one of all of the system I've described, because it does not comply fully or at all, in many cases, with that system. They are members of the World Bank. They have a resistance economy. They're increasingly intelligent enough to start building their own, what I call a Islamic resistance economy, which isn't about materialism, isn't about just profit of the individual, isn't about plundering other lands, isn't about dominating and being imperialist. So there's an attempt or an effort, and wherever such an effort is made, you will see the Anglo-Zionist Western money mafia nexus attack it. Venezuela is a non-Islamic example of where they do that. Standout example. Bolivia, I can name. Cuba, I can name as examples. Russia, perhaps as well, to some extent, and even China to an extent now, which is a rival to the Western economic powers. So again, there's another very broad look at various issues concerning this money power.
So Muslim bhai, from your discussion up till now, what I could understand is like the world is in control of these corporations or the companies who hold the major monetary system in their hands, and they dictate us through education system, through civilization, through advertisements, and through many other forms they have, which are like connected to human psychology or human nature or whatever you say, and they dictate us unconsciously or consciously, whatever you say, like what we should demand, or we should want, or we should do, or we should think, for instance. So if a person who are like all the people who are studying economics, for instance, if they want to understand whole of this hyper materialism or hyper, you can say, economic system of this world, what steps they can do to research better about this system, and how we can come out of this system, what other tools they do have which are controlling us. Obviously you have mentioned so many, and like banking system, and usually, and there are so many ways they are controlling us, and the way you mentioned, like they are going to see our, for example, where we are spending, how we are spending through banking system and whatever we call it. So how it is very important for individual to understand this type of modern slavery, if I am not wrong to say it. So are we really awakened to that slavery? Are we understanding this is happening, and we are like going to we are being affected by it, and not we only are getting affected by it, our generations to come are going to do that. And how what are the major steps we need to take, first of all, to understand the system, for example, because without understanding it deeply we can't uh, create a way out from it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think obviously having painted such a miserable picture of the reality of our economics and how the systems are so powerfully in control, the hope is there because uh, man is always aware of his divine fitra, and what he naturally wants is such things as freedom and to love and to be merciful. I think it's in the nature of man clearly to want these things. In order for him not to want that, first of all, the evidence is that most people are not that greedy. They do try to give. They do try to be generous in their own ways. You can see that even though the system tries to tell them to be individualistic, narcissistic, it's still not fully succeeded. And by and large, people revert to type and they go back to being charitable either in their own circles, or they go back to being generous, and they do want to help others quite a lot. But then there's this other dark side which constantly gets pushed at us about competition. So we're living almost like Jekyll and Hyde characters. We switch between the two. We in our immediate circle we might get competitive and jealous of somebody else's wealth, and then we become. They see they've got a car. I've got to have the same car. He's got a house. I've got to buy the same house, and that competition definitely exists. And it's as basic as buying a certain makeup, and it's owning a farm somewhere. So that exists. That's part of the satanic whispering or waswasa, which we know is promised, and it's part of our jihad, our jihad-i-akbar, the control the nafs. And I think that's the first place where it starts. We have to start with an analysis of ourselves and look at what it is that our values are. So if our values are rooted in prophetic examples in the Quran, then it's very easy, isn't it? You just have to look at the examples of the Ahlul Bayt, and you'll see it over and over again. It's not science to see how they lived. I mean, was the Prophet not potentially the wealthiest man in the world almost by the time he passed away? Was he not wealthy with Hazrat Khadija? Were they not one of the wealthiest families in Mecca? So it's not like the Prophet was destitute. He lived among the Banu Hashim, who were well-to-do, and he lived amongst, even in his marital life and his own hard work, he was generally a wealthy man. But he gave it all away. All of that wealth of Hazrat Khadija, was totally spent in the way of Islam, especially during the 3 years when the Banu Hashim were expelled and boycotted, and they were essentially sanctioned and were even forced out of Mecca because they supported the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Hazrat Abu Talib led the support of the Prophet Muhammad when they wanted to kill him and to destroy the potential of the system the Prophet was bringing. So you can see the economics of Banu Hashim, the economics of the Prophet, sided with justice and truth and divine prerogatives, even from that point onwards, if not, and it was there beforehand, because Hazrat Muttalib also had the same ideology, just as their father. So this ideology that we're talking about, this idea of economics and resistance economics, is very rooted in the prophetic heritage and tradition. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself in Medina had to implement a resistance economics because he was encircled, trade routes were cut off, Medina was sanctioned, boycotted, all sorts of things were done to destroy him. So you have hope there that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, faced these same situations. He had a money mafia in and around Medina. They were largely Jews. This is the reality. The Bani Qurayza and others were dominating the oasis. They dominated the growth of food in that area. They dominated the market. They controlled the market. They did everything the hyper-capitalists do today in order to hoard, commit usurious acts, and to generally keep the society under their control. So much so that the Arabs were always kept fighting as well, and that was part of the reason that the nomadic Arab tribes brought the Prophet Muhammad into Medina, because they couldn't resolve their problems. And one of the problems was the economics of Medina. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, looked at those problems, and they were huge. And the first thing he did was he said, okay, land, first of all, conservation areas. Don't just eat and destroy land. And he didn't rob people of the land. He didn't rob the Jews of what they had. But he looked at the trade system, for instance, and he immediately saw that there was a clothes shop. It was a controlled economy, and it was a little money mafia that was controlling the prices. So they were fixing and rigging prices at artificial levels so that they could maximize their profits. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, used his mercantile expertise, because he had been, of course, a merchant par excellence, taking caravans to Syria and back from Mecca in his younger days. So he used a lot of this economic knowledge and that contact and resource base to, I think, build a new market. And around Masjid Nabawi emerged a new economy, a new marketplace that competed with the old one. And initially he gave them a chance. These poor people who had no trading skills, they were probably trained, they were given products, they were shown systems, and they built up a new market. And he essentially created a rival economy. So it was a capitalist competitive system. So immediately when these marketeers dropped their prices, the new ones, the Arab ones, the Jews, of course, had to drop theirs. And suddenly you had this competition where people had a fairer trading going on. And that is one example of how the Prophet, peace be upon him, implemented the policy. Of course, usury was banned straight away, and that obviously must have upset a lot of the people. And this is why the Jews of Medina had lots of enmity with the Prophet and the elites even in Medina and Mecca, because he was fundamentally attacking the economic system. And prophets do this. As Isa, you'll recall, in the temple, is a very famous incident where he goes in and he attacks the money lenders and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and he throws over all of the money lender tables in the temple, because they're doing trade and business, basically hoarding money and extorting money from people in an unfair way. And it's not part of the virtue system. So what I'm saying is that there is hope. First of all, the first thing in answer to your question is that you must, first of all, understand your virtue ethics very well. And then those virtue ethics and that morality must match your economics. And if the system you live in isn't matching those values and isn't allowing you to work ethically, then you must look for alternatives. So if you know that transnational corporations, for instance, are providing arms to Israel, for instance, you boycott them. My first philosophy is when people say, "Oh, I don't know what to do." Well, first of all, what they say is withdraw your consent. Withdraw your consent. Withdraw your allegiance to those brands. Stop buying from them. Stop going to their institutions. Look for alternatives. And then people, of course, start getting into this habit, which the system has done, which has made them rely on convenience. And the convenience of buying some milk from, for instance, your local corporate shop or your convenience store is way different from going to a farm, maybe a mile or two outside your town or city, and going to a private farmer and buying raw milk from him. Now that raw milk will be better for your child, it'll be more powerful, it will be healthier, and but it'll be expensive, it'll be more expensive. And it won't be convenient. You'll have to go out to get it. You see, these hindrances are placed to stop people then going for the option which is healthier and which is also going to be, I mean, most mothers will say, "I would like to give my child healthy milk." They won't want to say, but the system is created in a way where ultimately you're almost made to go for the easy, convenient option because of the speed of life and the system. And this is the other thing. The system that you acquiesce to, your lifestyle that you have, and the careers you choose, and where you live, and the lifestyle you choose to live, is also very, very much going to dictate whether you can do anything in a system. So if you live in a city and not in a farming area, or if you have a flat and don't have a garden, how are you going to grow things? Because the alternative to buying things which are pesticidal and and food which is coming from exploited people around the world, often at with cheap labor. The opposite is to grow your own. But how many people have skills to grow? How many people even have a garden where they can grow? How many people have the time to grow? You see, this then puts us into a huge set of questions about, okay, this system is literally made to force us to do un-Islamic, non-tayyib activities. So your halal chicken is going to be bought from, for instance, a battery farm. There's nothing halal about that necessarily, certainly not tayyib, because it's been pumped with chemicals and all sorts of disease-ridden products which are going to cause problems for your cancers and whatever else you're going to catch later on in life or even early on these days. It's also being treated cruelly, where it's living in a little cage, which is not the way the Prophet Muhammad would have wanted it, because he said, look after your animals, the husbandry. It's being treated in a way where it's artificially grown, so they pump it with chemicals so it unnaturally grows, but we want the baby chicken. We don't want the old what we call murga, because it's not as tasty. So these again, we have our values to study here then, and resistance economy means change. And change means, first of all, you have to educate yourself to understand why that change must happen, and then you have to start working out how you're going to change. And perhaps in future shows we can look at more at how this Islamic resistance economy or an alternative economics can evolve. Say Bakr Sadr has done it on an intellectual level, but on a practical level, how would it be done for us as individuals? How would it be done for us as a community or as a nation? Well, we've got models for all of these things, starting with Iran and start going down to our own families, looking at the Prophet's life, and then trying to sort of, first of all, I think the first stage, as you hinted, is awareness that we have got a problem. I don't think there is that awareness by and large. And I don't think if there's no awareness, how are you going to ever start moving towards change? The awareness exists more within Western individuals, so movements about anti-battery farming, or movements for being anti-capitalist, being anti-corporation. Muslims are usually the last to join these movements because our interpretation of religion is not linked to reality of our lives. Religion for us is a ritual and worship of God, and that's worship of God.
Like boycotting so many things at the moment because of Palestine and all that. We see like as people are used to like complain that, oh, we don't have the same kind of thing available for us, for example, whatever we are using or consuming before. So here is so much problem, and there's so much to do as well as an opportunity if we see it. So today the time is really up now, so I'm really sorry to cut you here. So inshallah, these are the points we will inshallah discuss it further in details, especially the models you were discussing about the Muslim Islamic models for economic system. And I would like to say the viewers, we really need to think about our economic system, and we should create that awareness not only for ourselves but for everyone around us, so that we can work towards the change or the resistance economy. Thank you so much for watching us today. I'll see you next week. Allah Hafiz.